Bienvenidos al canal YouTube de la Fundación Cañada Blanch. El profesor Andrés Rodríguez-Pose, como saben, es el catedrático Princesa de Asturias y director del Centro Cañada Blanch en el London School of Economics. Y desde su toma de posesión quiere participar en todos los actos académicos que instituciones españolas tienen en el Reino Unido. Por ese motivo, ha aceptado una invitación del Instituto Cervantes que dirige el escritor 𝗙liche 𝗖̱ญ่en un curso que se titula Rethinking the World Today. La charla del profesor Rodríguez-Pose va a ser las ciudades y las regiones en un mundo post-COVID. Al hilo de esta conferencia, también me gustaría indicarles que el Foro Cañada Blanch, que dirige el profesor Rodríguez-Pose, este año va a estar centrado en la misma temática. Y van a haber 3 grandes especialistas mundiales que a lo largo del mes de mayo van a dirigirse a través del canal YouTube a explicar esta área de interés. El primero será Richard Florida, la segunda será Evelyn van Leeuwen y la tercera Paolo Veneri. Estos 3 especialistas también nos hablarán de las ciudades y las regiones en un mundo post-COVID. Muchas gracias y espero que disfruten de la charla.
Amigas y amigos, dear friends, my name is 𝗙tože 𝗖̱ญ่and I am the director of Instituto Cervantes in London. As some of you may know, Instituto Cervantes is a Spanish institution devoted to the promotion of the languages of Spain and Hispanic culture as a whole. I will keep my words very brief today, but I do want to welcome you all and thank you for being with us this evening in what I think is a very special occasion for us, the launching of a new series of talks under the name Rethinking the World Today with our friends from the Cañada Blanch Centre for Contemporary Spanish Studies at the 𝗙liche. I find it especially fitting that Professor Andrés Rodríguez-Pose has kindly agreed to deliver this first talk, not only because he is the newly appointed director of the Cañada Blanch Centre, but also because as Professor of Economic Geography and Princesa de Asturias Chair at the 𝗙liche, he is an extremely distinguished scholar. And in this series, we plan to bring together in conversation the best of British and Spanish scholars, researchers and speakers on contemporary issues, taking advantage as well of the brilliant moment social sciences are living in Spain. Today's talk will assess the role of 3 pandemic-related forces and the transformations they are likely to cause depending on the length of the pandemic, the social scarring instilled by COVID-19, the experiment of lockdown, and the need to secure the urban-built environment against future risks. And whilst it can be argued that the pandemic is unlikely to cause significant alterations from the point of view of economic geography on a large scale, at the microgeographic scale, COVID-19 may bring about a series of social changes in the structure and morphology of cities, suburbs, and metropolitan regions. It would be very hard, not to say impossible, to find a more qualified speaker for today's topic, since Andrés Rodríguez-Pose is without a doubt one of the big names in economic geography. To quote but a few lines of his CV, and before his current position, it is worth mentioning he has been head of the Department of Geography and Environment at the 𝗙liche, has published over 100 papers in academic journals, is the author of half a dozen books about his research interests, and has acted as consultant to different international organizations. Dear friends, this is all from me. It is not the first time that our institutions collaborate. We have done so many times in the past with Professor Paul Preston, and I wanted to thank Professor Rodríguez-Pose for this new step towards a meaningful collaboration between both our institutions. Before leaving now the floor to him, I just wanted to remind you there will be time for some Q&A at the end of the talk, so feel free to ask any question you have by writing it down in the chat, and I will pick them up from there. Muchas gracias, and I hope you enjoyed your evening.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, 𝗙liche. It's my pleasure to be here and to give this inaugural talk on this series of Rethinking the World Today. And I am even happier with this idea of this collaboration between the Instituto Cervantes London and the 𝗙liche Cañada Blanch Centre. And I'm very grateful to the Instituto Cervantes. I look forward for this being the first in a long series of collaborations. And I expect that also I would like to thank wholeheartedly the Fundación Cañada Blanch for supporting the center for so many years, and also for continuing to support the center after this change from Paul Preston to myself as director. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen in order to present the topic today. I hope you can all see it in your screens. As you can see, is cities and regions in a post-COVID world. And what I'm going to try to highlight here is talk about what has the pandemic brought about in terms of geographic implications. And you probably have noticed the fact that we're holding this talk virtually implies that this virus that you have in your screen, COVID-19, has taken our lives for now more than a year. We have all experienced long lockdowns. Our lives have changed. We are trying to survive in a much more difficult way. But it seems that although there's hope at the end of the horizon now with the vaccines, that this has gone long and it has had a much bigger impact than anyone would have expected for a pandemic in the 21st century. Having said that, COVID-19 is not the first pandemic to strike our societies. Pandemics have happened in regular intervals in the past. Probably the deadliest pandemic ever was in the 14th century with the Black Death that, according to some of the figures, wiped out 1/3 of the population of the world. Then the cholera pandemics that ravaged the cities, the big cities of Europe mainly, but also in North America during the 19th century, and also the so-called, badly called Spanish flu of 1918-2020, which caused about 55 million deaths and lasted for above 2 years. But there's hope. After the pandemic, our societies have always rebounded. The Black Death was followed by the Renaissance. In fact, some of the worst hit cities in Italy were the places where the cities were transformed, where the Renaissance was born, and where a new concept of a more modern, more rational type of city emerged. The cholera epidemics were followed by a significant restructuring of the sewage systems of cities, and followed by a period of prosperity leading to the Belle Epoque. And you can see an image from Paris there. And of course, the Great Flu of the one that happened a century ago now was followed by a period of prosperity, although that was broken by the Great Depression in 1929, but it was the period of the roaring 1920s. Having said that, we are still very much in the pandemic, although there might be hope in the horizon. If you take a look at the figures, since the 29th of February 2020, and these are figures coming from today, I took them from the Washington Post, there are almost 3 million people that have died as a result of the pandemic. And if you take a look at the figures that appear here, today we are on average, and over the last 7 days, there have been in the world about 12,000 to 13,000 people dying from the pandemic, which is not far away from the peak, which was in February. Of course, the peak has moved from one place to the other. Europe was worse affected during the months of March and April last year. We had in many parts of Europe, a new wave, a very important wave in January, February this year. And although vaccination is undergoing, what we find is that the virus is proving highly resilient, especially in those areas where vaccination is going far slower than most of us would have hoped. But in many parts of the emerging world, the pandemic is still at its high peak, and we're seeing high numbers of deaths. This pandemic and this situation of continuous uncertainty is creating a challenge for cities, is creating a challenge for the relationship between cities and their territories, and is creating a challenge for small and medium-sized towns and for rural areas. The situation before the pandemic was dominated by a greater polarization at territorial level. There were clear winners, and the winners were mainly the big cities. Here we have an image, for example, of Paris. To put this in perspective, in the 30 years before the pandemic, in France, there was only one region that grew above the national average, and that was the region of Île-de-France, the region of Paris. All the other regions, with differences, some doing better, some doing far worse, were growing below the average. And France was not the exception. In the UK, where we are at the moment, what we find is that there has been a huge polarization, a concentration of economic activity in London and the southeast, to the detriment, in many cases, of the north of England and other constituent nations of the UK. But we can say the same for Portugal, we can say the same for Italy, we can say the same for many parts of the world in which the big cities have been the most dynamic, and most other places, in relative terms, despite some of them doing better and some of them doing worse, have fared worse in general. Having said that, in the post-pandemic world, or since the pandemic, the inception of the pandemic, there was an impact, and the impact was mainly felt at the beginning in the big cities. You have an image of Temple Bar in Dublin here, completely empty, but that was not the exception. Again, it was the rule, and many people were confined in small spaces and cities, making life less tenable than what it was before, life less exciting, life less vibrant than it was before. And those who could, like in medieval times, decided to actually leave the city altogether to move to their second residences or to small towns and rural areas where they could get more space, where they could be more secure, where they could endure the difficult period of lockdown in a much greater way. So the big winners have been, and has been highlighted over and over again, rural areas and small towns and medium-sized cities. So the pandemic represents a challenge for big cities. The cities that were the main, which are still very much the centers of connectivity, especially for air connectivity, that was a big diffuser of the virus, where you had concentration of international travelers, and because of the sheer density of people living in those cities, became the early diffusers of the pandemic. So this challenge has been considered by many as a turning point. There's a lot of talk, whether it is in academic circles, but also in the media, about whether cities are not, or big cities are not, going to return to what they were before. And what we're going to see with more teleworking, with more need for bigger spaces, with more need to secure the space for future pandemics, we're going to go back to give an opportunity to those areas that we're losing out for so long, because now we can take our work and do it from anywhere in the world for a large percentage of the population. It has been heralded as the death of the last city as we know it. But is this the case? In fact, what we find is that technological change has allowed to delocalize economic activity. This is Thomas Friedman's flat world, and smaller, more remote locations not just offer protection and refuge against this and future health hazards, but also they offer important locations for the development of future economic activity at lower costs than what we find in big cities. But is this what we're seeing from the evolution of the pandemic? And let's take a look at the geography of the pandemic at subnational level in Europe, especially in the first big wave that was the one that hit Europe unprepared. And what we see first is that there is a significant difference in terms of the geography of the pandemic, or the first wave of the pandemic in the first half of 2020. What we see is that, in fact, you have some areas with big cities. You have Lombardy with Milan, you have Madrid, you have Paris, you have London, you have Stockholm, that were very hard hit by the first wave of the pandemic. But at the same time, what we find is that some rural areas did not do particularly well. If I want to focus in the case of Spain, for example, it was the area of Castilla-La Mancha, or it was the area of Castile-Leon. Many people say because of the proximity to Madrid. Catalonia was also hard hit. But also in the case of the UK, you have the whole of the West Midlands and the Northeast and Northwest, that had a severe impact from the pandemic. By contrast, in highly densely populated areas, for example, in the north of Germany, but also in the south of Italy, what we had was a much lower incidence. And in terms, this is the map of excess mortality, much lower excess mortality than in those places that were hardest hit. And in some cases, much less excess mortality than in previous years. In fact, if we take a look at the situation, 40% of European regions during the first wave of the pandemic had a lower excess mortality overall with respect to the previous 5 years. That was mainly in Central and Eastern Europe, but for example, in the case of Spain, it was the region of 𝗙će and the Balearic Islands, the two regions that had less excess mortality than in the previous 5 years. And in terms of cities, we take a look at regions and we find in this map, these are the 6 hardest hit regions by the first wave of the pandemic. And in some cases, they host big cities, in virtually all of them. Madrid, which was the hardest hit in terms of excess mortality. Third came Lombardy with Milan, London, Catalonia with Barcelona, and Stockholm. The only region without a large city is Castilla-La Mancha, but also in the vicinity of Madrid. But if we take a look at what has happened in other parts of Europe, and we take a look specifically at big cities, what we find is that in contrast to the concentration of excess mortality in the weeks between week 10 and week 15, 16, 17 of 2020 in Madrid, in London, in Barcelona, and the like, other cities like the capital region of Denmark, the region of Copenhagen, the region of Warsaw, the region of Lisbon, Berlin, the region of Rome, Lazio, and Campania with Naples, the third largest city in Italy, were hardly hit. So in fact, it doesn't seem that the pandemic is hitting cities in a generalized way, whereas some cities are hit hardest, other cities have a much lower incidence. And this is something that is striking when you take a look at the case of Spain, where at least during the first and second waves, the province of Soria, which has the lowest density of population in Spain, was the hardest hit by the pandemic. And when you take a look, for example, at the case of the US, the two hardest hit states are North and South Dakota, which have a very low population density, whereas a big city like Washington, D.C. is among the least affected by the pandemic, together with other less densely populated states like, for example, Hawaii. And this is not just a factor of the geography across regions and cities, but also within cities. This is a situation as it was in New York after the first wave. On the left, you have the excess of the cases per 100,000 inhabitants, and on the right, you have the excess mortality. And in the case of New York, this is one of the things that is striking. The area with the lowest incidence was the most affluent area, mainly of Lower Manhattan, and then areas like Brooklyn Heights across the East River. So relatively well-off areas where many of the citizens, as soon as the pandemic struck and the situation in New York became difficult, they decided to leave and move to other parts of the country, mainly to the second residences in either Long Island or in upstate New York, or many moving all the way down to Florida. By contrast, in those places where you had more workers that could not work remotely, could not telework, in places that were close to the airport, here you have JFK, here you have LaGuardia Airport, you had a much greater incidence of the pandemic, and also in excess mortality, as you can see here, and also both affected areas, some of the poorest areas of the city, which are mainly located in the district of the Bronx. So that was a situation in which, for example, in the case of New York, there seems to be a correlation between, on the one hand, the level of income of the different boroughs and the different areas, postcodes of New York. This is at level of postcode. So mainly hitting not the poorest of the poor, but those that are in the lower middle income ranks, whereas the wealthier parts of New York had a far lower incidence of the pandemic. Having said that, it's not universal that the pandemic seems to be concentrating on the poorest areas. During the first wave, if we compare New York to London and Madrid, what we see is that whereas in New York there's a clear gradient related to the income of the places where people live, the average income. In the case of London, this is by boroughs, or in the case of Madrid, this is by districts. What we find is that the line is flat. There's no correlation. It seems to have affected, on the whole, wealthy areas in a relatively similar way to poorer areas. So now we have the geography. The question is, what are the factors that explain the uneven incidence of the pandemic? What are the factors that explain why some countries, some regions, some cities, some localities have been worse hit, while others have done far better? And this is, in fact, what I'm going to be reflecting here is on work that I have been doing with Chiara Burlina from the University of Padua, and looking at the different factors of the incidence of the pandemic assessed by excess mortality, which we think is the less adulterated, if you want to put it in this way, type of index. And we find that in the case of Europe, this uneven incidence of the pandemic is very much related to wealth, but is not that poorer areas were hit hardest. In fact, what we find is that wealthier areas had a bigger incidence of the pandemic, whether it was because they were more connected or because they had bigger cities tend to be wealthy. In general, once you control for a lot of other factors, wealth has been associated to a greater incidence of the pandemic. And by contrast to what has been said, a lot of the finger pointing was towards the agglomeration and density. What we find is that either the size of the city, the size of the region, and the density, once you control for a lot of other factors, are factors that do not seem to have a strong connection, a strong relationship with the incidence of the pandemic. Is not density, as Richard Florida tends to say, is very often the question of whether you have agglomeration, but of people living in precarious situations that may contribute to the diffusion of the pandemic. And that varies from one city to the other. Accessibility is an important factor. However you measure, the most accessible places were hit earlier and were hit hardest. But it's not air accessibility, it's mainly accessibility by road. Those places that had better connections by road were the ones that were hit the hardest, that had a bigger excess mortality. This is logical because soon after the pandemic, most air connectivity across the whole of Europe and across the whole of the world almost came ground to a halt. There were declines in flights of 90%, 80%, depending on places, whereas road connectivity, in spite of lockdowns, although it declined, remained higher than the decline of air connectivity. Another factor that proves to be highly important is the readiness, the preparation of the health system. Those regions that had more hospital beds, that had a better presence of doctors and nurses, are those that have managed to weather the pandemic far better. Those that were ill-prepared, in which the health system was not just prepared for the pandemic, and virtually no one was prepared for the pandemic, but it was not prepared for any sort of health eventuality, are the ones that have fared far worse. And the same applies for climate. There seems to be a clear correlation between climate and the incidence of the pandemic, hitting areas that tend to be cooler and drier, whereas warmer places and more humid places have suffered a lower incidence. And of course, pollution that has been highlighted significantly, whether you measure it by particles in the air or CO2 emissions or the type of emissions, those areas that are more polluted, that were traditionally more polluted before the pandemic, are those that have had an important incidence as well. But another factor that has attracted relatively limited attention has been the role of institutions. And here, institutions have played a crucial role, at least in the first wave, in determining why some places have had a significant higher level of excess mortality than previous years, where in other cases, the lockdowns may have even contributed to a lower incidence and lower excess mortality than before. And here there are two types of institutions. On the one hand, you have the formal institutions, which is government and the quality of government, or the form of government, the level of decentralization of the country. On the other hand, you have the informal institutions, things like trust, like meeting of friends and regular meeting of friends, social capital, and different types of social capital. What we find is that institutions actually matter, and they matter significantly in determining the incidence of the first wave of the pandemic. We find that in more decentralized countries, once you control for a lot of other things, density, climate, preparation, readiness of the health system, and the like, the regions with a greater level of autonomy have managed to do better and control the pandemic to a greater extent than those with a lower level of autonomy. But more than the level of autonomy is the quality of government, both at the national and at the regional level, although the correlation seems to be far greater at the national level. Countries and regions with low government quality, but especially countries and regions, especially countries that have seen their quality of government deteriorate, that have seen an increase, for example, in lower government efficiency, that have seen a less well-functioning system of rule of law, that have witnessed greater polarization and also greater levels of corruption, are those that actually suffered a bigger incidence from the pandemic. There are similar relationships in terms of informal institutions. On the one hand, the question of meeting friends and how often do you meet friends. And here, in those places where there was a tradition of regularly meet friends, so more than once per week, for example, the incidence has been far greater than in those places where there was a lower tradition, according to social surveys, of people interacting with others outside work and the family circles. Very often, this extended family gatherings, extended friend gatherings have become vehicles for the transmission of the pandemic. Similar with social capital, but in another way, looking at the Putnam definition of social capital, what he considers as the most important form of social capital is the bridging social capital. That is the capacity of people from different walks of life to interact with each other and to connect and build bridges, a factor that is associated to more stable societies, to more dynamic societies, to more equal societies, also to more economically performing societies. We find that in those places where there was a tradition of stronger bridging capital, there has been a much greater capacity by society to adopt decisions on the basis of consensus, and that has had a positive impact on the pandemic. Those places with stronger bridging social capital are places that have seen a lower level of excess mortality, which in most cases would be associated to COVID-19. However, the only factor that we find that is non-significant, and this goes in line with more recent research, is the level of trust. In those places where there's high level of trust or lower level of trust, once you control for the quality of institutions, formal institutions, while you control for interaction and from social capital, we find that there's no connection between greater or lower trust and the incidence of COVID-19. The question is now, once we have looked at the incidents and the actually factors that can be connected to this uneven impact of the pandemic, let's get out the crystal ball and look into the future. And this is something that I have not done alone. I've done with Richard Florida, who's a professor at the University of Toronto, and my colleague at the LSE, and also professor at Sciences Po and UCLA, Michael Storper, in which we have looked at what are the forces that are driving change and how is that going to impinge on the future geography of cities and regions. How is that going to transform our cities? How is that going to transform our regions? And whether we're going to see that sort of reversal that I mentioned at the beginning of the trend over the last 3 decades of concentration of economic activity in the large cities. And as Ignacio said in his introduction, there are three, in our opinion, there are three forces of change. The first one is the social scarring that we're all suffering to a certain extent. I don't know you, but I have many friends who are now scared to go out, that shelter at home, at least until they get their vaccination, because of fear of getting contagion. And also because after more than a year in which most of us, or many of us, have been locked with different degrees of stringency in our homes, we have grown accustomed to being at home. So this is creating social scarring that for the majority of the population is going to disappear relatively soon after life returns to normal, and we have to think about what this normal is going to be, whether it's going to be normality like we knew it, or there's going to be some sort of new normal as it has been highlighted. But for a non-negligible chunk of the population, this might linger, this social scarring might linger and might last for quite some time. Then there are going to be changes that are being done to maintain social distance and to prepare ourselves against future pandemics. Our way of traveling has changed. Our way of shopping and going to shops have changed. Our way of going to restaurants have changed. The physical environment is changing. When we return to the office, or those that have already returned to the office, they have seen that their workplace, their office places are not the same as they used to be. And this is something that might last longer. But probably the biggest change is what we call the forced social experiment. The idea that lengthy lockdowns have accelerated processes that we all knew were going to happen, like teleworking, teleshopping, and the like. But we all expected that this was going to be a gradual process of change that was going to take years, if not decades. Well, as many countries closed in March, locked their citizens in March 2020, we have implemented those changes more or less successfully, in many cases, with no significant impact on productivity, for example, at work, almost overnight. And this forced social experiment has changed the way we shop, the way we work, and the way we interact. So who would have thought at the beginning of 2020 that, let's say, video conferences and video interaction and video gatherings would be the norm? But in fact, they are. And this is where we are at this moment. But this rapid transformation to going to your high street or going to your local supermarket and doing your shopping to virtually, and there were people that were already doing this before, but virtually more than half of the population doing e-shopping, a large percentage doing teleworking and video conferencing, is creating significant implications for cities and regions. This is an image of a British high street last year, at the end of last year. And what you see there is a situation of the pandemic. First is less people on the street, but what is more relevant are the boarded shops. if we are shopping more online, and you can see that the shares of Amazon have gone crazy since 2020, but that has an implication for small retail shops, and especially for the main street, for the high street in many of our cities. And there's going to be less need for commercial space in the future in the center of our cities, because we're teleworking. And of course, the question is, what share of people are going to continue teleworking after the end of the pandemic? The situation is probably going to return to more people going to the office, but it's not going to be business as usual. Some people are going to remain teleworking on a permanent basis. Some people are going to be, and some people have done during the pandemic, been working in their place of work as normal as before. But many of us are probably going, and we're seeing already firms taking these decisions, to mix systems of work in which we work 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%, depending on the place, from home, and the rest will be working in the office. So there's also going to be less need for working space. And there's less need for commercial space, there's less need for working space, there's going to be less need for leisure space, at least of restaurants, because there are going to be less workers on any given day inside the city. There's going to be less need for a lot of other services that are provided to people that, for example, go shopping in the inner city and are going to do less than before. So this has implications, because we're going to have to redefine our city centers, especially more than anything else at the micro level, because there's going to be redundant space, there's going to be change, but this change offers an opportunity for new people to move in. Maybe what we're going to see is a decline in retail price, not retail prices, but real estate prices. But new people might move in, transform the city, and we might see a new city emerging, which is, at least in the city center, different from what we have seen over the last few decades and even before. So this is going to have an impact on territories. And for many, at the macro geographic level, this represents a significant change. If you remember one of my first slides, what I put there was the concentration of economic activity in cities and how that had led to discontent. Here we have a situation whereby this offers remote working, teleshopping, etc., an opportunity for people to move out of cities, to move to places where they will get more space, better quality of life, to move to places where, in many cases, they would get more space, a bigger house, better services at far lower costs. And this would mean, according to many, a more equal, more, let's say, sunnier, if you want to take a look at the map of here in Spain and France, sunnier society in which you can work from wherever you can do it. I do think, and my colleagues think, that this is far too optimistic, that this is unlikely to happen for two reasons. First, because many rural areas, many small towns, many medium cities don't offer the same conditions as big cities. They don't have the concentration of skills, they don't have the concentration of firms, they don't have the diversity, they don't have the accessibility. They don't have, in other words, the factors that make the tacit knowledge, the factors that make big cities so dynamic and so successful. They don't have the economies of agglomeration, they don't have the positive externalities and the economies of scope that have driven cities. And the second is because if we're going back to models in which we're going to have a mixed system of economic activity with some days working from the office, some days working from home, you're going to have to live close to the city. You might not need to go into the city every day, and that's going to be an advantage, but nevertheless, you have to be in the close vicinity of the city. So maybe it might not be important to get your apartment right in the center of London or in the center of Madrid or in the center of Barcelona, but you can afford a bigger house in the outskirts. You can go to Hertfordshire, you can go to Buckinghamshire, you can go to, I don't know, Kent or Surrey or Sussex and get more accessibility. And then you'll only have to commute 1, 2, or 3 days per week, making your commute less burdensome than it was before the pandemic. So, and also the potential for people to work from a distance is going to be, the attractiveness of remote places is going to happen in just very few points. If you go to the Alps in France, that might be an attractive destination. Areas close to the Peak District in the UK are the same. In the US, we are always being told about Boise, Idaho, or we are being told about Jackson Hole, Wyoming, as places that offer the amenities that would attract these new people that can work from everywhere. But there are two factors here. In fact, that if you take a look at the data of the capacity of regions in the OECD that has been produced by the OECD this year, where what percentage of people can telework, you find that the highest percentage of people teleworking are still concentrated in big cities, whereas in most remote rural areas, but especially in areas that have a high presence of face-to-face interaction with clients, for example, in sectors where you have a high tourist sector, the capacity to telework is very limited. And a country like Spain is, with the exception of the region of Madrid, is at the bottom of the scale in the OECD with Turkey, with Chile, and other countries in terms of the share of the population that can actually telework. So unfortunately, what we're going to see is that the pandemic is not going to solve the problem of the greater polarization that we have witnessed in recent times between, on the one hand, big cities, on the other hand, medium-sized cities, small towns, and rural areas. It would be that some cities would continue to grow, some small towns and rural areas might benefit, but the majority, the polarization between big cities and small towns is going to continue, and probably rural areas in the end, most of them are going to be the big losers. There would be, however, a far bigger transformation within cities. I put two images of Madrid here, one of the suburbs of Madrid, on the other hand, the center of Madrid. And as I said before, there's going to be a transformation. There's going to be less office space in demand, something that was already happening in some cities before, but this has accelerated. There's going to be less commercial and retail space in need. Many restaurants and other types of shops are going down or are going to go down. It would depend very much on the length of the pandemic, bars as well. And there's going to be more demand for open space. So we're going to see a transformation of city centers. Probably the biggest winners are going to be, in the short term, the suburbs that, like, for example, between the 1930s and the 1980s in the US, where the ones thriving, we might go to a return at a bigger scale, more global scale of the role of suburbs. Whereas in inner city centers, what we're going to see is a need to rethink the uses and the cities. This might offer opportunities, because if there's less demand, probably what have been prices that have been overheated in most of our cities for quite some time may decline for a while. I'm not sure how long. I think probably it's going to be short-lived, but nevertheless may offer a window of opportunity. And that might bring in new people into the cities that would contribute to give the cities a new character. We're going to have to think about our cities in different ways, in ways that attract more open-air activities, more cultural activities, and there are a lot of proposals ongoing at the moment. So there's talk about the 15-minute city, there's talk about sustainable transportation, about the open city, going for a much more creative city with new residential uses, perhaps with younger people moving into cities, many of them that have been displaced by high rents and high real estate prices, and more of a leisure city in which the city becomes a place of gathering, a place of interaction, a place of meeting diverse people rather than a place to work and shop, and as it has been to a large extent until now. So what can we conclude from this? Well, what can we imagine is going to be the future of cities and regions in the post-COVID world? And as we have seen, the pandemic is affecting and will continue to affect the role of cities and regions. But this effect is going to depend on a number of things. The first one is how big the incidence is in each place. It's going to be very different in places where the pandemic has had relatively limited impact in comparison to places where the impact has been far greater. It would depend very much on the measures adopted to get out of this health crisis. I mean, it's been more than a year, so for many of us, it feels like eternity, but there's hope on the horizon. We have seen that vaccination success in the case of Israel, for example. We've seen vaccination success in the case of the UK. So if that allows us and those societies to come out of the crisis, probably the impact is going to be more limited. And there is going to be also significant variations in the capacity of cities because of historical reasons, because of the way the cities and the regions are configured in order to redefine uses and spaces. Having said that, the pandemic, with all its negative impact, with all its deadly toll, we talked about almost 3 million already after a year worldwide, offers an opportunity to rethink our cities and to rethink the relationship between our cities and other spaces. There will be winners and losers, like in any sort of process, like in any sort of transition. The winners would be those that are more able to adapt and to change, but not all spaces are going to have that capacity. Those spaces that are going to be more successful are going to be those that create the best conditions for good living, those that have, let's say, perhaps more or better amenities, but also those that create, in this post-pandemic world, ecosystems that can develop new ideas and attract talent. And in this respect, we are already seeing cities that are positioning themselves in this situation, cities that are transforming themselves relatively rapidly. That's the case, for example, of Paris, whereas in other cases, in many North American cities, for example, very little is being done at the moment to prepare the environment for these changes. The same applies to regions. Some rural regions, some remote, small-sized towns are trying to make themselves attractive to attract these sort of people. Some of them will be successful, others will not. But if you do nothing, the likelihood that you're not going to be successful increases and increases significantly. But on the whole, as I was saying, not everyone will have the same capacity and the same ability to adapt. Differences in institutional capacity, in political conditions, in social and economic, the social and economic environment would make a significant difference. But as I said before, this pandemic is, despite its deadly toll, is offering an opportunity to generate a more efficient, fairer, and more sustainable territorial system. But in order to do that, we must grab that opportunity with both hands. We should first fight the pandemic with all our forces, but at the same time, we should prepare to make sure that we have a more livable, sustainable, and resilient society wherever we live all over the world. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to try to reply to any of your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Rodríguez-Pose. It was really a fascinating talk, a true anatomy of the life we are currently living. And now, as you mentioned, there are some questions in the chat that I will read out to you in a moment. So, for instance, there are many. So, okay. So Wolfgang Petzold asks, former OECD findings suggest that federal systems perform economically better than unitarian ones. Is there evidence that the current findings on COVID-19 contradict this?
Sorry, the question was that decentralized systems perform better than...
Whether federal systems perform economically better than unitarian ones, and is there any evidence that the current findings on COVID-19 contradict this?
All right, so thank you very much, Wolfgang, for the question. I think this is a very interesting question. I mean, our findings show that in general, more decentralized governments, regions with greater capacity, with greater autonomy, fiscal autonomy in this case, and political autonomy, tend to perform better or have performed better within the pandemic. It doesn't mean that this is all going to remain throughout. In fact, once you control for a lot of other things, the impact increases. But nevertheless, this is something that, for example, in the past, in the case of Europe, and that's where I'll be, the evidence that decentralized systems perform better than more centralized system is highly controversial. Why? Because I mean, there's evidence. It depends very much on the period. It depends very much on the type of sample or the countries that you include on there. What is true is that in the case of Europe, many regions that have had a long tradition of decentralization tend to be regions that in the past had exclusive powers over the health systems, and probably as a result of that experience have been able to react to a virus in which the incidence has not been equal across countries, but it has been highly diverse in terms of its impact geographically. And it has allowed them to experiment. One case is the case of Italy, where decentralization fundamentally encompassed health, and where we had different sort of approaches against the pandemic and dealing with the pandemic between the regions of Veneto and the regions of Lombardy, with an approach that in the case of Veneto was much more connected to treating those with the virus at home rather than bringing them into hospitals and then contributing to the diffusion of the virus, at least during the first stages of the problem.
Well, thank you very much. And now, 𝗙់_𝗖̀ goes straight to the core. How does the COVID situation affect the revenge of the places that don't matter in relation to rising populism?
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's that goes directly into my type of research. It's very difficult to say because at the moment everything is stuck, and of course, in many cases there has been a sympathy and support to governments and decision makers in these very difficult times, and that's understandable. The question of whether we're going to see a continued rise of populism as we saw in the period before the pandemic is going to very much depend on how different types of territories fare in the years to come. And as I said, the pandemic doesn't seem to be capable of addressing the growing imbalances that were at the root of large chunks of the rise of discontent and resentment against the current system. So we cannot just hope that, as if by magic, the pandemic is going to address the territorial problems that have been brewing for quite a long time. What we're going to be able to see, or what we're going to need to do in this case, is probably because of what I highlighted before, that the macro geography is not going to change. We're going to have to be proactive, and we're going to need, if not more territorial policies, better policies, more efficient policies that would go to the root of the underdevelopment or low performance of many parts of Europe, but also many parts of the world that have witnessed a significant decline in recent years and that have said enough is enough. If we're sinking, we're not going to be sinking alone. We're taking the whole boat down, the whole ship down with us.
Well, thank you very much. Are there any clues, asks Zachary Wilcox, are there any clues from your research about which institutional factors may help us adapt to the forces of change better? Um, for instance, how will our planning systems and tax systems adapt to acceleration and to online shopping?
Okay. Well, there are two questions here, Zach, and thank you very much for your question. The first one is probably related to what happens during the pandemic and to what happens after the pandemic. And if we go to what happens during the pandemic, what we have seen is that very often many of our countries and many of our regions thought they were better prepared. They were somewhat nonchalant. This is something that's happening in China or is something that's happening in Italy. It's not going to happen in our regions. It's not going to happen in our cities. The reality is that when it arrived, because they thought they were far better prepared in terms of health systems, in terms of government reaction capacity, in terms of being able to set up the systems that would monitor and trace the contagion, they perform much worse. And many of those societies have struggled throughout the pandemic and continue to struggle in order to implement what should be relatively easy, like vaccination processes at the moment. Having said that, we're learning. And we've seen, especially in recent weeks, a significant improvement in many areas in terms of health delivery and health tracing, meaning that probably also, even if there was no widespread vaccination, which let's hope is not going to be the case, might lead to a more, at least in the case of Europe, a greater containment of the pandemic. On the other hand, you're raising a big number of issues regarding what's going to happen after the pandemic, because the pandemic is bringing transformations. You mentioned retail, you mentioned shopping, mentioned work, you mentioned the mobility of people, that maybe people are going to be able to work in countries that are different from where they are. Well, they're going to be able to remote work in countries that are different from where they have their physical work. And that is going to have significant implications for taxation. So how do we tax Amazon, for example? How do we tax the big retail giants, especially when most of their taxation goes to tax havens and where the impact that they are having on the rest of the economy is phenomenal? Just to put an example, the retail sector represents 15% of all employment in the European Union. Amazon has a bit more than 1 million workers worldwide. If most of that shift goes from retail and high street sales in Europe to the benefits of Amazon, the problem is not just a question of taxation, it's what to do with the large share of redundant workforce that is going to take place. How are we going to redeploy those workers? What are going to be the outlets, especially not just in this sort of situation that my colleague Richard Florida calls a retail apocalypse, but also that there are other forces pushing in the same direction, like, for example, automation. So there are a lot of questions that need to be asked and need to be asked more seriously than they have been asked until now. And they require answers, and answers that cannot no longer be answers that are done, I would say, at the local level or at the regional level or even at the national level. They require answers that should be done at the European level and also at the global level.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. Vasilis Margara, sorry if I mispronounce any names. Thanks you for the presentation, like many others do. And he asks, will the second wave infections, will second wave infections change some of your findings. Is it possible that they do so? For instance, federal Germany doing less well than in the first wave. He also asks, why did some rural areas perform so badly? For instance, Soria in Spain, and do other health issues need to be taken into consideration? For instance, regions with high levels of obesity, like in the USA.
Okay, thank you very much, Vasilis. And there's three questions in one. So let me just go to the first one. Is second, third, fourth waves, are they going to alter the results? This is an evolving sort of situation. The pandemic is still ongoing, so there's going to be changes. And we will only be able to get a final picture once the pandemic is over, but we cannot wait. We have to start looking at the analysis, like in order to make sure that we are prepared for future waves and we are prepared for what's coming afterwards. Having said that, yes, it's other places have done worse in this second wave, and it's not just Germany, but many Central and Eastern European countries that, for example, were relatively spared during the first wave have done much worse. But I always like to highlight one thing, that during the second wave, right before Christmas, many Spanish newspapers actually focus on how badly Germany was doing. And when you take a look at the numbers of infections and when you take a look at relative to population and excess mortality, in virtually all weeks in that period, Spain did worse than Germany. So overall, there might be changes, and we need to monitor again the situation. But there are underlying causes that are inherent to different places that would remain, and many of those were the ones that have been identified for the first wave. Why have some relative low density areas actually performed badly or have had some greater incidence of the virus? Here, I suppose, is something that in the end is not a question of density, but a question of how well people follow norms and how well people react to, let's say, to confinements and similar situations. When you think that because you are in a remote rural area, the risk of contagion is more limited, and therefore you behave as nothing has changed, the risk of contagion increases. And therefore, that's why places like Soria might have a significant impact. In other cases, it might be a question of political choices. I mentioned the case of the US. In the US, the worst hit areas in terms of states are North Dakota and South Dakota. The worst hit area in the case sub-state is the Texas Panhandle. These are relatively remote and rural areas, but these are areas where business went as normal, as usual, and for political reasons or other reasons, they thought they were immune. We're seeing the situation now in Brazil, in which the virus is running riot, and that might be also a political consequence of political choices. And therefore, what we need to do is probably make sure that it's not in the end a question of density, it's a question of how people behave, how attitudes, and that goes back to the whole situation of institutions. On the third question, which is about obesity, from medical reasons, and of course, I'm not the one to answer this type of question, we know that the virus is far more dangerous for people with underlying health conditions like obesity, but also for people the older you get. So in those places where you have an aging of the population, where you have high obesity, measures might need to be more stringent until there's vaccination for all. And that's why we have prioritizing in terms of vaccination, and rightly so, certain groups of the population. Why? Because if in Spain we have a relatively bigger incidence in places like Soria, and Soria is has a low small population, but the population is an aging population, the mortality rates are going to be far higher than if it happens in, for example, in the Canary Islands, where the population is far younger.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. Are you happy with the 3 last questions?
Absolutely, yes.
Excellent. So, on a more cultural note, JC asks, is there any evaluation on how the fast adoption of telework, online shopping, etc., has also highlighted its risks and might have contributed to a growth of cultural resistance to its negative implications on lifestyle? For instance, the loss of high street commerce and and street life in general.
Okay, thank you very much. And this is a very interesting question and something it's still ongoing, and we don't know. We don't know mainly because many of us are still in lockdowns or in partial lockdowns, and life has not returned to normal. Of course, here in the UK, pubs were open on Monday, not indoors, but outdoors. And just walking around the city, you would see that everyone was flooding to pubs, but it was not everyone. The city feels far more empty than before. There are more people at home, there are more people somewhere else. So we don't know whether all those that have left are going to return. And of course, there are going to be a lot of people that are going to resist changes and want to go back to life as normal as it was before the pandemic. There are going to be people that are going to change. There's a need to analyze, because there's always going to be a need for retail. There's always going to be a need for going to the office. There's always going to be, but the question is, in what numbers? And if those numbers don't make many of those shops viable, what we're going to have to do is to reinvent our cities and to reinvent them in big time. And here, the question would be, if we reinvent them, which way should we go? And I hope that is going to be, the city is going to remain a place for gathering, for cultural activities, a place for meeting, meeting outdoors, hopefully indoors as well, and for reinventing space. Because there's going to be a shortage. If we all move to or a large percentage move to suburbs, there's going to be a shortage of interpersonal contact with different people from ourselves. And therefore, there would be a far greater need to move back later on into a city that is going to be a slightly different city, or perhaps more than slightly different from what we have known until now.
Good. And not completely unrelated to this, Colin Stuart McIntyre asks, what do you think the future of the suburbs of European big cities will be like?
All right, so my guess is that, first I have to say that suburbs in Europe are very different from suburbs in the US. Suburbs in the US are far more extended, they go far greater distances, and there's less public transportation. In the case of Europe, in many parts of Europe, from Germany to Spain, etc., the UK, France, the suburbs are more compact, they tend to be closer to the city, and they tend to be far more connected by public transportation. So many of those suburbs are going to win, and they're going to win in the short term. They're going to attract more people looking for cheaper prices, looking for better space. So the suburbs might win in the short term. Probably they will retain some sort of dynamism. There's going to be, we saw it before the pandemic, but it's probably even more movement of office spaces into the outskirts of the cities. And that has a risk, it has an advantage that people might be closer to work, might have to commute less into the city, but there's a risk that we might go to situations where we saw in parts of the 20th century, in which very often we see workers coalescing into areas that are close to offices that are located in the suburbs, meaning that your life, your work, and your interaction, your social interaction is with the same type of people. If having suburbs and winning suburbs leads to more segregation, either by type of work, either by income, or by, let's say, ethnic or religious characteristics, then society is going to be poor as a result. If we have more diverse and vibrant suburbs, there will be still a need for vibrant and dynamic city centers, but nevertheless, the impact would be lower, and probably the suburbs are going to remain dynamic and attracting people for quite some time.
Good. Well, thank you. And we now to last, because I don't want to, I mean, there are so many interesting questions still. 𝗙់𝗿chị asks whether we could we disentangle the role of institutions from the cultural propensity to follow rules. She says that it seems likely that places that like their institutions or are able to have better institutions are also the societies that have been better at following the rules, designed to stop the spread of the virus.
Okay, so thank you very much, Annie. I think this is an interesting question, and you're probably better qualified than I am to answer it. But here, one thing that is we need to highlight is that following the rules is very often connected to the efficiency of your institutions and the perception of your institutions. When you have clear guidelines that are consensuated among different groups, when you have a tradition of bridging, then it's much easier to generate trust, and that trust is going to be translated into responsive societies that follow the rules, and that is reflected in lower incidence of the impact of COVID. We have plenty of examples in Europe. There's a situation, for example, in Norway or in Denmark, which have had a relatively let's say, low incidence throughout the whole of the pandemic, first, second, or third wave, mainly because it's not that the institutions are better functioning. There are more efficient governments, less corruption, more trust in government, but also because there's trust in those institutions. When you trust, like the Norwegians do, that your civil servants, when you trust your politicians, when you trust your judges, when you trust the police, you are likely to follow what they are saying. And because you know it has been consensuated and is the result of a discussion among groups. That might not be the case in where you have less efficient institutions, where you have constant changes of points of view, where you have constant changes of decisions, where you have strong polarization, which makes it very difficult for the population to actually trust what is being decided. And then you have a less, or not a lower capacity, a lower willingness to actually follow the rules, which in the end turns out to have a bigger incidence in terms of the impact of the pandemic. In fact, one thing that's interesting, and I would like to highlight, is that how stringent the lockdowns were is very often not connected to the incidence of the pandemic itself.
Well, and this is from a friend from Ukraine, and I think his question gives voice to what many people are thinking all over the continent, and also in Britain, people from small cities and the governments. What should small cities do to be sustainable and attract more tourists? What good practices are there that you can recommend?
So sustainable to attract more tourists. And why tourists? Sorry.
In a sustainable way, I gather.
I mean, I think that every territory needs to make sure that they provide sustainable development for the people who live in those territories. And I would not say, as I said before, The pandemic, in whichever way we look at it, is going to make us poorer. It's making us poorer and it's going to make us poorer. There's going to be a recovery after the end of the pandemic, but nevertheless, many parts of the world are going to take years to go back to where we were in economic terms in 2019. So this is not going to be an automatic recovery. What we need is to plan. What we need is to create strategies for every single territory in order to make sure that the challenges we are facing now and we will face in the post-pandemic period can be tackled in a sustainable and in a resilient way. And there's no magic formula. There's no single way. There's not just that we can just say, let's go like it's being proposed in many countries at the moment, let's go digital and let's go green. We have to go digital and we have to go green, but we have to adapt any sort of transformation. We have to improve the skills. We have to improve the competitiveness of our firms in whichever sectors they are. And we have to make sure that our sectors are capable of reinventing themselves and transforming themselves by improving their capacity to innovate, by improving their competitiveness, by improving their technological component, and by also migrating to nearby sectors. If we do that in every single territory and we implement policies and development policies in a place-sensitive way, many of those areas that are suffering now are going to be far better prepared to weather the storm and to be capable of withstanding any sort of challenges in the future. Doing nothing is not an option. It has been proven again that those places that don't plan, that don't have ideas, that don't know where they're going, don't have a strategy, tend to do much worse than places that have a strategy, regardless of how good and how efficient that the strategy is.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, and thank you very much to all of you who have attended this talk tonight, the first in this new series, Rethinking the World Today. Thank you very much. Gracias. Buenas noches, Profesor.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure. And thank you very much to the Instituto Cervantes once again for hosting this event.